All right, so this lesson is lesson 2, actually chapter 2. It's titled Weathering and Erosion, and we're going to begin on page 26, all right? So, let me ask you a question. What do we say, or think about what you think about the way cold affects water? How does cold affect water? How does it affect water? Yep, it could freeze, it could turn into ice, yes. How many of you like cold weather versus warm weather? I'm a winter person. I like winter. All right, well today we're going to be learning about ways that water and the temperature of that water affects rocks, okay? I know you probably think, really, Miss Oda, we really want to learn more about rocks? Well, we're going to, but it gets better, I promise. All right, so from huge granite mountains to tiny particles of sand, rocks are all around us. I live in Rocky Gap, and they truly, anytime you go to dig something, there's rocks everywhere. I don't know if you guys know where Rocky Gap's at, but there's rocks everywhere. Plenty of rocks, all right? So for us, we use them for building, for industry, for technology, even for landscaping, for pleasure. They form the foundation of the earth, but rocks are also constantly moving and changing. Forces such as earthquakes, we talked about those, they actually grind and shift rocks, while volcanoes spew out lava. And when that cools, it forms rock. Heat and deep pressure within the earth form and transform rocks, while on the surface, wind, water, and break down and move. All these natural processes are continuously changing the surface of the earth. Okay, so first thing we're going to talk about is the rock cycle. All right, so look in your book with you. How many of you have heard about the rock cycle before? All right, good. So the rock cycle is really a way to explain how rocks are formed. Is the best and easiest way that I can tell you. Now, so looking at the rock cycle under weathering, though rocks vary greatly, how do geologists classify them? They classify them into 3 different categories. What are those categories? And you want to highlight these words as we go through. In your book, any bold words that you may have. But what are the 3 categories that geologists, because what are geologists? They study rocks. Yeah. So they classify rocks into sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic. What do they call the changing of the rock cycle? The changing of the rock. The rock cycle. I gave you the answer. Highlight that word there as well on page 26. So they use a diagram on this page to show you what they think happens to rocks. Now, notice that if you want to look on the screen, you can, or you can look at your book. But notice that the 3 classifications or categories of rocks are igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary, and they're all formed in different ways. Just like God formed us all in different ways, they're all different as well. Now, we see here that we have, let's go over to the next page. It says many, and then we'll come back to it. Many scientists, because it actually connects with the other page as well. Many scientists think that the earth is ancient. What does ancient mean? Really old. That's right, ancient. And some of the Earth's materials have moved completely through this cycle. What are creationists?
Do they believe in creation?
They believe in creation, absolutely. They believe that the Earth is much too young for that to happen. Although each of these rock changes is occurring today, massive amounts of new rock types are not being formed. Most kinds of rocks are very hard, but even the hardest rock can be broken down into gravel and pebbles and sand and silt and powdery clay. So the process of breaking down rocks is called weathering. I see the people at home, how this goes together. Oh, not bad at all. That's pretty good. All right, so rock cycle works. Now, so we see that you have igneous rock under great heat and pressure. And when you have igneous rocks, probably not the best place to start, but that's where I'm going to start. You, under great pressure, it forms metamorphic rock. So we're starting with igneous rock. So how does igneous rock forms? And you can see it on the page 27. That forms when the magma, where does magma come from? Magma cools either below or above the earth, the surface of the earth. So it can be below the earth or like volcanic, that type of way. Look at the arrow going here. My arrow's opposite here, but igneous rocks can melt to form magma. Look at this hot magma. You see this hot magma? Magma, when it cools, it forms the underground rock, which is igneous rock. Here you also have that hot magma that as it forms a igneous rock and it cools, it forms a igneous rock, and then it cools, and then it's heated under pressure and it forms metamorphic rocks, which actually form below the Earth's crust. Now, what about sedimentary rocks? They form when the sediment of the remains of tiny living things settle and harden. So that happens under pressure of great heat, and pressure forms the sedimentary, and then on down into metamorphic, and then it's reheated. It's a cycle. It just keeps going and going and going and going. Okay? Look with me. You'll see that on your other page. Highlight that word as well. Weathering. And that's the process of breaking down rocks. You're going to hear that now for the next few years, okay? Now, let's go back on page 27. Here, we talked about weathering. Go up to the top on the course. Sometimes we read together and sometimes I read with you, but since there's just a few of us, I'll read today. But we usually divide weathering. So we've talked about 3 types of categories of rocks. Now we're going to talk about 2 types or 2 categories of weathering. Okay? And that is mechanical, highlight mechanical, and chemical. That's the 2 type of weathering that we're going to talk about right now. Okay? Now, mechanical weathering, we're on page 27, breaks rocks into smaller and smaller pieces. So mechanical weathering is sort of breaking them apart and apart and apart and apart. And then when you think of chemicals, what do you think of?
Dangerous.
Okay, that's a good thing to think about. So yeah, you think of something maybe hazardous or something that could catch on fire or something. But that is good, because when you think about chemical weathering, what happens when you have chemical weathering, it actually transforms, it changes that rock into a new substance. And we're going to talk about like acid rain and various things that causes the rocks to change. Something they have in common is both of them happen either near the Earth's surface or on the Earth's surface. Okay? Either like underneath, near, or on the Earth's surface. It says here that the process of weathering usually takes years or even centuries. It happens little by little. Big rock worn away into small pieces, okay? All right, let's move on to the next page. Weathering, and this time we're going to be talking about what? What do we have here at the top? Mechanical weathering. When you think of mechanical weathering, think of a physical change. What is a physical change? What's an example of a physical change? Would you say a change in looks? Or it changes, well, let me read you. Mechanical or physical weathering is the process of breaking down rocks into smaller pieces. Okay? It's kind of like decomposition, but it's breaking rocks down into smaller pieces. So if more of a rock's surface is exposed, a greater amount of weathering will occur. Of course, there's other factors that play into that, such as temperature, water, wind, and plants and animal life also contribute to mechanical weathering. And here are some examples of mechanical weathering. Follow with me here. You have frost wedging. Highlight that. Now, what is frost wedging? I'm going to tell you. So, when water freezes, does anybody know what happens to water when it freezes? Does it get smaller or what? It expands, exactly. So, if water, let me just say this. If you have like a break or a crack in a rock, it usually starts very small, and water gets down in that rock, and it freezes, then it's going to widen that rock and maybe even crack it and make it larger, make it break up into other pieces, okay? Another one is fast heaving. Frost heaving, not fast heaving, frost heaving. Now, this occurs when water gets where? Down underneath the rock. So as the water freezes down underneath the rock, it expands, it pushes the rock up further, pretty much out of the ground. And it tells us here that at one time farmers in cold weather areas believed that rocks grew in the field. They didn't understand how they were rising up when really there was water underneath them that was freezing and expanding and causing the rocks to rise up. They thought rocks were growing. So if you take a damp sponge and squeeze it, you guys done that before, and squeezed all the water out, you've actually put that sponge under pressure, okay? So when you open your hand, then what happens to the sponge? It expands back out, okay? So that's what happens to rocks sometimes too. Some rocks are also under great pressure, and so if there's a shift under the ground or shift in the ground, that can reduce the pressure, and that causes the rock to expand rapidly. This kind of pressure is called pressure release. That's in the second column, highlight that. Then we touched on exfoliation and abrasion just a little bit. Pressure release and exfoliation. So, that is pressure release. Now, often they have cracks that results in exfoliation, and that's when sheets of the rock sort of peel away. It's being exfoliated. Girls, you would understand when you go and get a pedicure or something and they use that little thing and they scrape off the dead skin, if you've done that before. That's exfoliating the dead skin, okay? That's what's happening here with rocks. And then you have an abrasion. When you have an abrasion, that's when the rocks rub against each other, and it can be caused by water or wind, and could be when large stones roll across even smaller pebbles and so forth. I think of an abrasion as a bruise because you accidentally fall and you scrape your knee on something. That's an abrasion, and that's what happens to rocks. And when that happens, it breaks them down into smaller pieces, okay? So it also shows you a picture of abrasion here, okay? Rocks that have been abraded for a long time are rounded and have smooth edges. Sometimes rocks that have been, I guess, tumbled, when they've been tumbled and rolled and rolled and rolled, they actually become smooth instead of even more finer. Now, go on to your activity manual. Page, wait a minute, we're not done. We got to talk about hoodoo. All right, go over to page 29. All right, so now, you guys, we haven't experienced a whole lot of strong winds. We've had some strong winds, but strong winds can do more damage to a lot more things than just trees, knock down trees, things like that. If you look with me, a strong wind can also abrade rocks when it picks up particles of sand. Hey. And as the textbook tells us here, it tells us that as men sometimes use sandblasters to remove like grime or paint off of something so they can refinish it. That's the same process as of abrading. But hoodoo, what is hoodoo? Well, abrasions do not affect all types of rocks. But soft rocks, you believe it or not, some rocks are softer and some are harder. But the softer rocks will wear away more easily from abrasion. Okay? And then sometimes this creates an unusual formation called a hoodoo. Everybody see that picture of that hoodoo on that page? So the top of the rock, the top of the hoodoo is harder than the rock on the bottom. That's why the top of that rock didn't really abrade away, but the bottom part did. It was probably all at one point in time the same. All right? Now, over in the next column, you see fires, floods, and other catastrophic events can cause mechanical weathering as well. Can cause weathering into breaking rocks and different things down into smaller pieces. Okay? So, this lesson right here is on mechanical weathering. The next lesson that we will do will be on chemical weathering. All right, so now let's look at activity manual page 22. All right, some of this we'll get to tomorrow, but we're going to go ahead and start with O. At the top it says, scientists often have differing viewpoints, just like we all do. How they interpret their observations and data reflects their viewpoints. For example, many scientists believe in an old world that is a million years old. I don't believe that. I believe in creation. Others believe in a young earth that is only thousands of years old. Now, mark O if the statements reflect an old earth viewpoint, which is more likely evolution, and Y if it reflects a young earth viewpoint. Number 1, read that for us. Gabby? Abby, that'd be good.
It does not take millions of years for rocks to change form.
Okay, was that a young or an old? Young. Put a Y on that blank. Number 1 on page 22. Number 2, you want to read that, Adam?
All rocks began as igneous and gradually changed to other forms.
That's an old belief. Okay, O. How about number 3? Sophia?
The materials that make up the earth have passed through the rocks.
And that is also an old view. And number 4, Miss Emma?
During the flood of Noah's day, some parts of the rock cycle probably occur very quickly.
And that is a young belief or a creationist belief. Okay? Now we're going to look at the web here. Well, you see it's a web right here. And we're going to talk about mechanical weathering. The first thing you're going to write in the middle is what mechanical weathering is. Okay? And what is it? It's the process of breaking rocks into smaller pieces. It's the process of breaking rocks into smaller pieces. But frost wedging is frozen water splits rocks. So we don't really need to elaborate on that anymore because they've already filled that in for you. Okay, now we'll go over to frost heaving. All right, frost heaving. We'll just go in with which one?
Frost wedging.
It's already on there for you, bud. You don't have to worry about that one. Okay? Yeah. Just move over here to frost heaving. So you're going to write frost heaving. And what is that? That's frozen. It's when frozen water lifts up the rocks. Remember the old farmers used to think rocks would grow out in their pasture? And it was not true because it was just when the water would get underneath and would freeze. Pressure release, as you see here, is when there's a release of pressure on the rock causes cracks. When there's some pressure on the rock and it causes cracks. is when sheets of rocks peel away. Think about, sometimes you'll get a face scrub. I'm sorry, fellas, you guys don't think about those type of things. But when you get like a face scrub, and that actually peels away dead skin as well, and that's a type of exfoliation. But with a rock, the sheets of the rocks peel away, and when that happens, that's called exfoliation. All right, abrasion. Abrasion is when rubbing causes wearing away of the rock. Abrasion. Rubbing causes wearing away. That's another form of weathering. Come in and be filling that in. That is events such as fires and floods that cause weathering, catastrophic events.